that I would try to explain something that, in listening to my last lecture, I think I glossed over and did not explain very well. And there's sort of two parts to it. The first is that, as I mentioned, quoting Nicias on the shores of Syracuse, in the Greek mind, the people are prior to the city. The people comes first. We see that in Aristotle. In the Roman mind, the city comes before the people. You could not be Roman unless there was a city called Rome that could be inhabited. Now, that is significant, and it is also significant that Rome begins as a political association. It doesn't actually evolve into that, where they themselves marked their beginnings from a specific point in time when this concord was reached between Latin and Sabine, according to the myth. That it was, from the beginning, a political association that was an amalgamation of a variety of different cultures, perhaps combined with the fact that their gods were not already present in a place but had to be conjured up by a ritual, meant that they could move around, and wherever they went, they could conjure up those gods, and if everything was okay, they could then sort of say the sooth and lay out the diagrams and plow the pomerium, found the city, and at that point, once you inhabited it, you became Roman, regardless of where you came from before that. That perhaps accords them a certain advantage in terms of the long-term success in sort of foreign territories. So today, after we go through the buildup of the Roman Forum, we will then move to colonial cities. We may not get through all of that today, but we will, as I said, consider this part 2 of a 4-part module. Now, the material record is interesting because the material record confirms to some degree the myth of this synoicism, this joining together. Because in the Forum itself, in the Forum Necropolis, which, like in Athens, was covered over at some point and reoccupied, in the same grave shaft were found cremation graves and inhumation graves. And if you recall, the Sabines practiced inhumation, the Latins practiced cremation, and so what you've got is a husband and wife, or a wife and a husband, a family unit, in other words, being buried in the same grave shaft, one of which was cremated, one of which was through inhumation. So there is a kernel of truth in the myth. And this actually is, I think, significant because if you could ritualize that in some way, it meant that then you could, the gods being portable in a sense, you could then carry that wherever you were, and you could sort of conjure it up, and then if you did the ceremonies right and performed the rituals right, plowed the pomerium, this is what we're going to be talking about, put in the Cardo and the Decumanus and the Mundus and the Capitolium and so forth, all the major sort of public constitutional elements, it didn't matter where you were, it was still Rome. It was a little Rome, and thus the planting of locks of hair, first fruits, dirt from where you were born that you would put into this hole and then seal it up was, in a sense, symbolically planting a piece of Rome into the ground somewhere else, right? So all of their cities were done this way, those thousands of cities that they built. Well, let's go back then to the ancient city, the beginnings of Rome. The two significant hills here being the Palatine and the Capitoline. Capitol, by the way, is where our word in English, Capitol, comes from the building. So the state Capitol is spelled with an O, and Atlanta is the Capitale, spelled with an A. Capital means head, cap, decapitate, and had to do, capital, also money. It had to do with the number of head of cattle you had, right? So there's this distinction. Capitol actually takes its name from this hill, Capitol. And then in between was this sort of flat, swampy area with a small stream flowing through called the Velabrum. The dots that we see right here is that Forum Necropolis. And just on the edge of that Forum Necropolis, two buildings would emerge in the middle of the 8th century BCE. One was the Regia, the house of the king, and the second was the Temple of Vesta. It is in these graves that we see here that, in fact, those inhumation and cremation burials were found in the same grave shaft in 1902 by Giacomo Boni. The Capitoline Hill here would develop as the arcs or the citadel, similar to the sort of, not the same, but similar to the Acropolis, with the giant temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, the largest temple, very ungainly building, aesthetically not so pleasing in certain respects, but double the size of the Parthenon, huge. And then the asylum, the area in between. The view from there looks like this, and I want to mention one thing. The site of the accord here would be plowed out as the Comitium, and there is the Mundus, which is actually attached to it here on the banks of the Velabrum. And that's what it looks like today. The forum was ultimately filled in. We'll see some examples of that in a moment. The site of the Comitium was here. This view is taken from the Capitoline Hill looking into the forum. The Mundus is actually this structure that we see right here. And then later, Septimius Severus in 202, actually his sons in 202 of the Common Era actually built this some 900 years later and sort of destroyed it all. There we see the Temple of Vesta, and we're going to concentrate now on this area that we see here. This is the Palatine Hill that we see up here. So in the myth, in the story, we would have had Latins on the Palatine, and the Sabine, Titus Tatius, would have had this view, and everything that we see down in here would have been a swamp about 16 feet lower than it is right now. And this is the Augustan period, 1st century BC AD, right on the cusp of that level of the forum, the historical level of the forum, with a stream flowing through it, right? So these two buildings that we see here at number 45 and number 46, number 45 is the Regia, or the House of the King, and number 46 is the Temple of Vesta. Vesta was a very old pre-Roman cult that had to do with the sort of symbolic familial hearth. She was the goddess of domestic affairs, and the priestesses of the cult of Vesta were to keep the fire burning. That was their primary goal. But it was attached to and part of what is now believed to be a much larger sort of imperial, not imperial, but royal complex that we see here. Now you'll also notice that all of the orientation of these buildings is pretty much in this direction, with the exception of this that we see right here, because that was the original orientation of the forum that we will see in just a moment. There is showing true north and true south, east and west. The circle or oval that you see in the upper right quadrant is the Forum Necropolis. And then the black circle that we see here at the intersection is the House of the Vestals. And apparently this was part of this much larger complex, all of which was oriented, as you'll see in the Regia, the remains of this building that we see here, all of it was oriented in this particular direction. Now, the reason this is important will become apparent as we go through the colonial town founding ritual. The only place, one of the only places, there are only 2 or 3 places where this registers, the original orientation registers, is here in the atrium of the House of the Vestals. That's the Temple of Vesta. That's the remnants of the Regia. Right here, we see this pavement. And if we actually zoom in on that, I put a compass here and snap this, showing that the joints of the flooring is actually directly north-south. The Vestals, of course, smoked a lot of cigarettes, and so we have the remnants of that there as well. That's a joke. Okay. There we see then at this end of the Forum, the Regia and the Temple of Vesta, as they emerged in the historical period. Now at the other end was the Capitoline that I've already mentioned, with the big Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus and the Citadel, which contained the Temple of Juno Moneta. And then we see these sort of public assembly places here, the Comitium, the sacred hole in the ground called the Mundus, which actually had a stone on top of it called the Umbilicus, symbolically connecting it to the heavens, the underworld to the heavens. And then this very ancient temple here, which was the Hades, or altar of Saturn. Saturn had originally been on the Capitoline, but he kind of got kicked off and moved down the slope. It's sort of a side story, but anyway, the Etruscan influence is evident in the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, which began with the last of the 7 kings, Tarquinius Superbus, in 510 BC. He would only have a year to work on it before the Republic was formed. He was thrown out and the Republic was formed, and they continued to work on it and completed it, which was then subsequently rebuilt several times throughout the Roman imperial age. Again, the Roman temple is distinct from the Greek temple in that it is not peripteral, meaning the columns do not go all the way around it. It has this very pronounced pronaos, or front porch, very frontal, sitting up on a high podium here with a 3-part cella with Jupiter in the center and Minerva on his right and Juno on his left. There is a scale drawing, just to give you a sense of the size of this thing, a scale drawing of the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus on the left, and on the right, the Parthenon on the Acropolis in Athens. And you see how much larger and also how much uglier this building actually was. So we began to get then, after the conjoining during the regal period and on into the early Republic, we get a sort of embryonic public space emerging down here at A. This will be the Forum. The signal act was the encapsulation, as we'll see, of this Velabrum stream into a sewer called the Cloaca, means drain, Maxima, the great drain. This was an enormous public health move because it got all the E. coli bacteria away. It also meant that they could actually pump gravel into the Forum, drain the swamp, and raise the level of it so that it could be used as political space. Huge engineering feat. This occurs in the middle of the 6th century BCE. The water supply, so here we see the Forum Necropolis, totally abandoned by this time. The Regia, number 4, which remained in the Republic even though they no longer had kings. They instead created an office called the Rex Sacrorum, the king of sacred things. Some very famous people became that. In fact, they held the office of Pontifex Maximus. The Pontifex was the keeper of the bridges. Pont, keeper of the bridge. Remember the salt trade, controlling the salt trade and the wooden bridge across the river. So embedded in their religion was the notion, in fact, that this is sort of part of this collective thing. You're the curator of the bridge. Later, in the Christian period, popes will assume that title. The water supply for the embryonic city was this spring that flowed here at the base of the Palatine Hill called the Fons Juturni, where it then flowed into this little winding stream. And then here, the original site of the Comitium with a sacred spot called the Lapis Niger, a black stone. Number 3 is the Mundus. And the gray building is the site of the original Curia. What is the Curia? It is the equivalent of the Bouleuterion in the Greek city. It was where the Senate met. Originally, they met outdoors, and the Senate is actually an interesting thing because the Senate, it actually comes from a Latin word, cenaculum, which is embedded in our English word senile. It meant old man. And this was the tribal council that acted as a kind of advisory body to the king and elected the king. They elected the king. Later in the Republican period, they would elect the consul who actually presided over the Senate. But the Senate could pass no laws. The Senate issued decrees. And then once this gray building is built, the Popular Assembly moved there were four, but one of them moved into the Comitium. And then all of this would play out in public on the steps of the Curia, where the Senate would meet and debate an issue. They would issue what was called a Senatus Consultum, the advice of the Senate, and then the tribune of the plebs, right, came down off the steps into the Comitium. All this acted out in public, and gave it to his colleague in the Comitium, where it was introduced into legislation, and it was voted on. And it was voted on in blocks based upon your income. Based upon your income, believe it or not. Complex and arcane reasons for that. It had to do with, in time of war, you were responsible for paying for your own equipment. So if we superimpose that on the top of the archaeological map of the Forum, we see that the orientation of the Forum was originally quite different in this strict north-south alignment. Adjacent to the Curia, another building was built in the early Republic, which is called the Basilica Porcia. And then to the left of that, the Carcere, the Mamertine prison. This is actually the prison. Incarcerate comes from that term. And we notice this Greek word, basilica, which originally meant the house of the king Archon, but in Rome it became the law court. So what we have here then is the legislative branch, a bicameral legislature, a Senate and a House in effect, the judicial branch in the basilica, and then it all sort of begins to make sense. Later, this would all move, and you see superimposed on this the outline of later buildings that would come in, including the moving of the Curia here and the eventual displacement of the Comitium that we see here. This is the Lapis Niger that we see there with the rostrum, the speaker's platform, facing out onto the Forum, somewhere about right there. Okay, that curve that we see right there was the site of the original rostrum that faced out into the space of public assembly that we see here. That is the Lapis Niger. In 1902, it was excavated, and they thought, according to tradition, that it was supposed to be like the Heroon in Paestum. They thought they were at the tomb of the founder, so everybody's all excited. We found the tomb of Romulus. Well, Romulus wasn't in there. Nobody was in there. Instead, this stone was in there, and the stone is the oldest Latin inscription known, which is fairly significant since all the text in here is written using the Latin alphabet. That was actually a taboo, saying that no one could defile that spot. This is a sacred spot. And just to the right of that, over here behind this stone, was in fact the Mundus. The original water supply, as I mentioned, was a spring. This was later captured in this small little temple front called an edicula, and it opened out into a small basin that we see here. It ceased to function as the primary water supply of the city a long, long time ago, but it retained symbolic importance throughout the entire Roman period. There we see Juturna. This is actually an altar, and this spilled out here down into a basin that we see down here. So there is the Lacus Juturnae and the Fons Juturnae. So this begins to make sense. Over here we have the former house of the king, now the house of the high priest, and the functionaries of government, the college of priests. Here we have the temple of Vesta. Here the space of political assembly, the Mundus. Here is the legislative branch, these two. And here is the basilica, the judicial branch. And here this ancient temple of Saturn. In 550, roughly at the same time that the forum stele, that chipus, that stone that was found under the lapis niger. The labrum stream was, as I mentioned, encapsulated in stone and buried as a sewer called the Cloaca Maxima. There you see it sort of as it tracks through its course. The sewer, built in 550 BC, was taken out of service in 1936. That is at least one definition of sustainable. Now the question then would be, did they treat their sewage? No. So as the Tiber became more and more polluted, they had to bring fresh water in by piping it in via aqueduct over incredibly long distances. I'm just showing here that later the Curia is moved, and there is where it was moved to. The ancient Curia Hostilia is underneath this church. Underneath this building is actually the entrance to the Carcere. So this is what it began to look like then as time in the historical period, in the Imperial Age. Again, just to locate you, the Cloaca Maxima, crossing through the Forum, exits at the foot of the Palatine, between the Palatine and Capitoline, and comes out underneath this arch, which is called the Arch of Janus. Janus was the god of those entry points that were not a violation of the pomerium, the boundary. He had two heads, front and back. January is his month. He was Father Time, right? The old man and the boy. He's looking in two directions, and as I said, January was his month. Janus, no equivalent in the Greek world, entirely Roman. The sewer passed through here, just to the right of this photograph, and emptied out into the Tiber, and there we see it. That's actually the Cloaca Maxima, constructed in 550 BC, rebuilt several times. And then the modern stone facing that we see here was done in the 1930s when the quays were built along the sides of the rivers. I also found it interesting that this homeless guy here, who has a little camp up there, probably doesn't realize that he's actually sleeping on top of a 550-year-old sewer. There's still some effluent flowing through it. It stinks, but it's possible to actually walk through it. So as time went on, they sort of outgrew the orientation, the original orientation, and so they had to re-inaugurate the city, which we'll get into later, and crank it around 42 degrees within the same quadrant. New judicial buildings called basilica were built here and here, and later those would become the two major law courts in the Forum. Every Roman city had a basilica. Later, that building type would be appropriated for congregational worship in the Christian period, and thus the name is often transferred to the name of a Christian church. Even though it is a building type, it doesn't describe its function, it describes its type. It was the law court in the Roman world. Well, where does this come from? I have a theory. I'm going to show it to you real quickly. This is the Stoa of Attalus. I think what they did is they took the Stoa, the Greek Stoa, they cut it in half. They then reversed it and joined it together, and what you got was side aisles, a nave, and then shops at least on one side, or later side chapels that open to the interior. When this functioned as a law court, typically it would have an edicula at this end, actually at both ends, and the entrance was on the side. And it is there that like this apse that we see is where the judiciary, where the magistrates would sit when court was in session, and lawyers would confer with their clients here in these side aisles. The basilica form, of course, was to get light through these clerestory windows that we see here down into the nave. It's a very old church, Santa Sabina. Some of you in the room have been in it. Some of you are very familiar with it. And that's about as close as we can get to a first century AD Roman law court. That's what the building would have looked like. Okay? And there it is, the Basilica Fulvia Aemilia, built in 179 BCE. The brick building that we see in the background here is the Curia Julia. It was begun by Julius Caesar, completed by Augustus. There we see, looking down the nave. And there we see it as number 5 with money changers and shops at number 2 and 3, opening out stoa-like onto the Sacravia. And then a second basilica is constructed at number 35 on the map, which is called the Basilica Julia. Again, the curia is changed and moved, and I've got to go back and get rid of that because it's inappropriately placed. This is the Basilica Julia. It was a very large building that we see looking down toward the Palatine Hill that we see here, and then here we have the Temple of Vesta. This is the Temple of Castor and Pollux, which those 3 columns stood through all of time, and it's irrelevant really to this discussion. This is the 42-degree rotation within the same quadrant that I mentioned, so that by the late Republic, this is more or less what the Forum looks like. Now, this set a pattern that would be repeated in a certain way over a long period of time outside of Rome in all of their colonies when they would inaugurate a town. Again, all of their colonies, all of their colonial enterprises were inaugurated prior to occupation. That is what made them Roman.